I'm talking today in my third introductory lecture about Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery. I'm going to discuss some themes in his book. I'm going to discuss various issues and problems as well. In the fourth lecture, which follows, I'm going to talk a bit about the way in which Popper added things to the approach of his Logic of Scientific Discovery after that book was published. And once we have that in front of us, I will then move to more detailed discussion of a variety of particular topics. So then, introduction. What is his book about? Essentially, I think it's a theory of methodology, which is in effect an epistemology or theory of knowledge in methodological clothing. I'll discuss many of its specific themes in subsequent lectures. Popper's broad approach is distinctive. Why? Well, in the preface to the English edition of uh, Logik der Forschung, that's to say, the logic of scientific discovery, Popper distinguishes his approach in the book from two other approaches which were common at the time. On the one side, there was an approach which was at the time popular and which in many ways still continues in its popularity, an approach which stresses the significance of formalization. The other approach, which has pretty much gone out of fashion now, is British ordinary language philosophy. This included the kind of approach that you get in J.L. Austin, but also a lot of work that was being done in Britain and by some people in the United States who've been influenced by the work of the later Wittgenstein. Popper's viewpoint here seems to me to be an interesting one, but also in some ways to be a little bit ambiguous. As he explains in his A Realist View of Logic, Physics, and History, which is most conveniently found in Objective Knowledge, his concern is with true knowledge about the world. And in this context, logic is valued by him, but it is seen by him as an instrument or a tool. That's to say, Popper's view seems to me here to contrast with that tradition in analytical philosophy, which takes logic as somehow giving us the underlying truth about the structure of things. And uh, of those people who, while not actually adopting such a view themselves, nonetheless behave as if such a view were true. It is, it seems to me, as if they'd never quite repudiated the ideas of logical atomism, within which such a view about the essential role of logic would, I think, make perfect sense. For Popper, rather, what we should be concerned about is the world and in getting to interesting truths about it, or as coming as near to such truths as we can. At the same time, Popper himself clearly valued the contribution that logic could make to philosophy very highly. In particular, Tarski, in the formal theory of truth that he offered, was able to resolve for Popper some informal problems that had plagued him about the semantic paradoxes. And Popper wasn't alone about this. A number of people in that period wanted to have a straightforward idea about truth, but just couldn't work out quite what to do with the idea and how to avoid paradoxes in a theory of truth. Popper also more generally valued other work in logic, for example, in terms of clarifying the differences between syntax and semantics. Excuse me, I'm just going to mute a few people who've joined us recently because we're getting a bit of interference. And as also, in his view, offering ready to hand theories about such things as how we should understand the content of a theory. All this was important because it helped Popper resolve problems that he couldn't otherwise solve, and suggested how he might go about tackling questions about which he felt that he needed to say something. And here is a picture of Alfred Tarski, the Polish logician, whose work on truth influenced Popper so much. How may one best understand what is involved in causal explanation? I'm going to give this as an example of something because I think it raises some problems in Popper about formal approaches to philosophy. In Popper's view, explanation is best seen in terms of the creation of a logical structure within which a statement of what we wish to explain may be deduced from premises which contain universal laws, and also so-called initial conditions, where our premises to be acceptable must also be independently testable and pass tests, and ideally also be true. Popper's ideas here are interesting, and they've been the subject of arguments about priority between himself and Carl Hempel. But they don't seem to me sufficient as a theory of explanation for reasons that Popper himself discussed in Appendix Star 10. The star appendices in the Logic of Scientific Discovery are ones which were added at the time when the book was translated. 4, we can distinguish, as Popper did in that context, when discussing perhaps the now extinct New Zealand bird, the moa, between claims which happen to be universal truths. For example, no moa can live for over 50 years, and ones in which we claim that it wasn't possible for moa to live for over 50 years. These, as Popper seems to me to indicate, very plausibly look like claims made about the structural properties of the world. And here is a picture reconstructed of 2 New Zealand moa. We don't know exactly what they look like. This apparently has been reconstructed on the basis of fossilized species of the moa. It made me think, I wonder what I would look like if a picture of me was reconstructed from fossilized species of mine. But let us pass over that and get back to the proper topic of the lecture. Where, however, if you take such an approach at some level, what these things are that is necessary is going to depend at a deeper level on something that's contingent, as Popper puts it in his discussion in that appendix with reference to some ideas of the philosopher Leibniz. Consider that the world is the work of God, who, a bit like, for example, a composer, choosing to work within a particular aesthetic form, voluntarily restricted his own subsequent choices when then going on to construct the world. It wasn't that God was constrained, but that, as it were, if he imposed certain constraints on himself, then within that setup, various things are necessary. Within what he chose, some things are thus then necessary. But where it would have been possible for him to have made different choices within which other things would have been necessary truths. All this seems to me personally to be most useful, and it's something that I would have thought we may need to make clearer if we're making claims about causal relationships. That's the thing. I think there's a real difference between something being contingently universally true and necessarily universally true, subject to various other things at a deeper level, even though those being the case was itself contingent. But, and this is really my point here, it seems to me that what's involved in this is then a problem in cosmology. That's to say, concerning how we're claiming that the world is structured, and about what we're tentatively claiming is necessary or contingent within it, in the light of certain contingencies which we tentatively claim to exist on a more fundamental level. Rather, however, than talking about these matters, many logicians seem to me to talk, if they're interested in necessity, instead about modal logic. The technical work that has been done by them in this area may turn out to be useful in relation to particular technical problems. But also, I'd have thought to shift into this rather than talking about concrete issues in metaphysics and what we conjecture about the physical structure of the world is actually a badly retrograde step. It is, however, worth noting that these ideas, in the development of which I've drawn on Popper's appendix to the Logic of Scientific Discovery, Appendix Star 10, should be understood, I think, as correcting certain presentations that Popper gave of his own ideas. For example, in The Bucket and the Searchlight. It was a very interesting lecture delivered originally in 1948 and which was then published in English in his Objective Knowledge. Popper, briefly towards the end of that piece, discusses the history of ideas about explanation. He is critical of Cartesian, that's to say, associated with Descartes, and later ideas about there being material requirements on explanation, and argues instead for a purely abstract approach. That's to say, one as exemplified by his own formal theory and also the requirement of testability. You might say, in effect, if you want a slightly lurid picture, if you can imagine someone doing striptease dancing, various things, substantive ideas about explanation are cast off, just leaving the purely abstract approach at the end. Now, it seems to me one can surely agree that specific Cartesian or other mechanical requirements are unnecessary in the sense that it's not clear why we should insist on them. But at the same time, there seems to be no problem about someone developing a research program advocating a specific such approach. They may find it difficult to explain things in those terms, but if they're attracted to such an approach, it seems to me to make perfectly good sense. Further, the Appendix Star 10 discussion about the mower seems to me to show the inadequacy of a purely formal approach. My personal reaction to all of this would be to say that I think we should put formalistic approaches back, as it were, in their proper box. They've sort of spread over into everything, and I think that they should be restricted. That's to say, I think there's something to which we should have recourse when, but only when, we face formal problems. Indeed, while logic is important in itself and plays a key role in the philosophy of mathematics, once it became clear that logical atomism isn't viable, it's not clear to me why people bother with formal logical representations to the degree to which they do. And that if they do, I think they need also to make it clear the degree to which what they're doing depends on conventional choices about how things are to be represented and about the rules of inference that they're going to be using. There has been an implicit promise that once things are formalized, this will solve philosophical problems for us. But there is, in some circumstances, a mania for putting into formal representation pretty much any statement that someone makes in the context of a discussion of philosophy, as if this is supposed to assist us. I'm not convinced that there is in general anything to be gained by it, unless there is an ambiguity that this helps us to overcome. I mean, that's to say, something which Popper defended very strongly, of only clarifying terms when they actually look as if there is a problem about them. Or, I think, if we are trying to tackle a formal problem. While at the same time, I think there's a lot may be lost. It seems to me that a lot of philosophical reasoning actually works much better in informal language than it does in strictly formalized ways. The idea that it's essential, if we're to do philosophy, and thus must be taught to everyone, seems to me a bit on a par with the old claim that there used to be in Britain that Latin was essential, not just for historians or perhaps also for those who aspire to go to the Christian heaven, but for everybody. In what I have to say about Popper's work in these lectures, I will accordingly minimize stuff to do with logic. But I'm well aware that my views about this are contentious, and I'll pass on some references to literature which takes a different view when I make notes based on this particular lecture. This is in part on the basis of the kind of argument that I've offered here, and in part it's doubtless due to the fact that I find doing logic about as easy as trying to read things in Arabic script. That's to say, for me personally, almost impossible. Although I'm quite ready to admit that this may simply be a quirk of mine, in effect, a form of dyslexia, so that I just personally find anything that isn't in a Roman script as very difficult to tackle. However, my initial line of actual argument would hold good even if logic and the Arabic script came to me as naturally as does breathing. Lest this be misunderstood, I'm 100% in favor of the separation of logic and psychology, although it's worth noting that many issues recur, albeit in different and interesting ways, if one investigates the content of our psychology. For example, intentional objects, as there has been a concern with them within the phenomenological tradition. That's to say, it looks as if a lot of things that Popperians often want to refer to just in terms of world three could also be raised about the content of our psychological processes when they're intentional. And I'm fully appreciative of the advances that have been made in problems of the philosophy of mathematics and of logic, which obviously call for technical work. Although I'd also say that, in my opinion, if someone is being taught logic in a philosophical context, I think it should be required that they're also taught the kinds of things discussed in works such as Susan Hart's Philosophy of Logics. It's not that I'm endorsing her particular views, and for an interesting response to her later book, Deviant Logic, from a critical rationalist perspective, look at Larry Briskman's From Logic to Logics and Back Again. But my reason for suggesting this is that she discusses all sorts of issues there that I think people making use of logical techniques need at least to know something about and to be on top of, whereas logic is often taught to people as if they were being initiated uncritically into a Kuhnian normal science. Back now to Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery. And just on the side, I'd mention Larry Briskman's has a book of his called A Skeptical Theory of Scientific Inquiry has recently been published, albeit at great price, by the Dutch publishers Brill. What about Popper's approach? His central concern in the logic of scientific discovery is method, as I explained in the first lecture. In addition, Popper's approach isn't naturalistic or descriptive in two senses. First of all, he's not setting out to describe what scientists do. He's not making a claim about sociology or the history of science, although particular scientists may in some respects behave as Popper suggests, but his theory isn't about the behavior of scientists. Issues relating to this point become a point of contention in relation to Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos, and we'll look at this issue and its implications in a subsequent lecture. Next, on Popper's account, our methodology also depends crucially on our decisions about the aims of science. One obvious reason for this is that, as I've explained, it's possible and perfectly legitimate for people to choose different methods depending on their views about the aims of science. Although these views are open to critical discussion, and to say that choice is possible isn't to say that every choice is equally good. We shall see that on Popper's account, what is to count as experience is also a matter of decision, rather than, as it were, a fact of nature. What about the aim of science? In The Logic of Scientific Discovery, Popper talked about the aim of science in rather general terms, but he drew a contrast between two approaches. People who saw the aim of science as being a body of fixed truths, specific bits of which could be protected against refutation by way of a conventional decision, or something, the main ideas within which could be open to falsification and improvement. At the time, all Popper could do was to describe the different approaches, indicate that he favored one of them, and to stress that, depending on what one chose, different methodological rules would be appropriate. He was later, notably in his paper, The Aim of Science, to elaborate on his ideas about the aim of science in more detail. I'll discuss this in the next lecture. Popper is at odds with empiricism in certain respects. First, just because of the kind of combination of a naturalized Kantian and biological approach that he took to our psychology. He just thought that anything in the tradition of Lockean empiricism, as it were, wasn't actually a good description of what our psychological experience is like. For Popper, our knowledge involves anticipations of what things are like, based in part on a psychological need to impose order onto things, in part on biologically based predispositions, but also because of the role of ideas from our culture, possibly our religion, our metaphysics, or whatever, some of which may also be built into the particular language that we use. All these, though, for Popper, while being psychologically a priori in the sense of being things that we bring to our experience of the world, and things which may profoundly affect how we experience the world, are far from being a priori true. Such ideas need to be tested and critically assessed and contrasted with other approaches. We can never tell when our ideas about what we're experiencing, and more generally, our other background expectations and procedures, may be problematic and in need of critical discussion and improvement. And it is typically by way of critical questioning from other people, or the conducting of tests which might seriously call our pet ideas into question, that we discover that things may be wrong. We may indeed be all too confident about such things just because they haven't yet been questioned, and also because they seem to be confirmed by all our observations, not least because we're looking at everything when we observe it against the background of such ideas. Three things, however, are important here. The first is that even if such ideas survive critical scrutiny, it's important to remember that they are still fallible. The second is that there's nothing wrong with having such presuppositions. Amongst other things, having presuppositions cannot be avoided. It serves no useful purpose, in consequence, simply to point out that people have presuppositions. There is no alternative to doing so, and some of people's presuppositions may well be correct. They may well be true. The key thing, rather, is to see if there are ways in which our presuppositions may be examined, if people call them into question, and to try to detect faults in them. And if so, then to see if we can replace them with better ones. Popper also argued, however, that we can't take experience as something that's without philosophical baggage. And accordingly, he was critical of that line of thought, which one gets, for example, from David Hume to the positivists of his own day, which simply appeals to experience in terms of saying that unless something is given in our experience or is a memory of experience, where memory itself is typically in this tradition, but surely incorrectly seen as a mechanical process rather than something that involves creative work and interpretation, then unless it is one of these things or is a formal truth, the people that Popper is taking issue with wanted to claim that these things are meaningless. Popper, by contrast, argued that we stand in need of a theory of experience, and further argued that in his view, for something to be empirical requires that we follow distinctive procedures. I'll discuss his ideas about this in a later lecture when I discuss Popper's theory of the so-called empirical basis. Popper was critical of the positivist view that metaphysics was meaningless, and indeed he came to the view that positivist theories of meaning are one unsuccessful attempt to distinguish between science and non-science, and that the entire enterprise of declaring things meaningless was basically a waste of time. Clearly, different specific such theories would need to be criticized in different ways. And one specific criticism that Popper offered of the theory of Carnaps, it's in a paper in his Conjectures, was that this theory would allow for the formulation of what could be called arch-metaphysical statements, say statements about God, by way of negating ordinary empirical predicates, while inadvertently ruling out significant parts of science as meaningless just because of its universalistic and unverifiable character. By way of contrast, Popper argued that his own response to the problem of induction was not a theory about meaning. Empirical statements, he argued, were characterized by their falsifiability. And he also argued that this serves to solve the problem of demarcation between scientific and non-scientific theories. For Popper, metaphysical claims can be perfectly meaningful. Indeed, as I've indicated, he thought the view influential in 20th century philosophy from the early through to the later Wittgenstein that people make lots of claims that were meaningless was futile, as it could only be sustained by way of question-begging definitions of what is meaningful. And indeed, Popper indicated in The Logic of Scientific Discovery that certain metaphysical claims have played an important heuristic role in science. Later, as I mentioned, he was to develop his own ideas about the role of metaphysical research programs in science, and also to suggest a metaphysical perspective in terms of which current science might be developed. But what of the problem of induction and of Popper's response to it? In Logic of Scientific Discovery, Popper argued that Hume was correct in his argument that induction couldn't be justified. But Popper then offered his own non-inductive theory of science. That's to say, for Popper, scientific and more generally empirical claims should be falsifiable. For example, they might consist of the claim, all elephants are grey, or perhaps there is an elephant of ordinary size and visibility in this room. These may be distinguished from claims such as all events have a cause, or there is a particular minuscule virus present somewhere in this room. Each of the latter may be true, and we may even be able to confirm the statement about the virus. But we will typically not be able to falsify either of these statements, although Popper wouldn't disagree that they're meaningful, and indeed that they're either true or false. And even that as science develops, we might in the end be in a position to test for the virus much as we can now for the presence of an elephant. So far, so good, but some problems immediately arise. The first is, but suppose that some statement is testable. It's tested, and the test seems to go against it. What should we conclude from that? Popper's view of this seems to me clearly set out in Logic of Scientific Discovery. That's to say that there are two aspects to testability, the logical and the methodological, and that what makes a claim empirical is not just its logical character, but also how it's handled in the face of prima facie refutations. Ideas about this form the heart of Popper's approach to methodology and epistemology, and I'll discuss them in detail in a subsequent lecture. Next, one might ask, is Popper's approach really non-inductive? As I think A.J. Ayer objected to him, for example, in P.A. Schilp, editor The Philosophy of Karl Popper, what if refutations were like what used to be called childhood diseases? That's to say things like chicken pox, which certainly as I was growing up, in, say, Popper's lifetime was simply something that it was expected that all children would have, and which once they'd had them, having had them gave them immunity from further infection. In the face of this, does one not need, I was suggesting, some kind of inductive assumption that refutations will continue to refute, that in this respect, the future is going to be like the past. And there is a picture of A.J. Ayer. Popper's response to this is that it is handled by the requirement that scientific laws should be universal in their scope, and further that there are methodological arguments for preferring that we should try to assess claims in that form. If this is the case, then a single good refutation is fatal, although we need to bear in mind that what's refuted is a system of laws and initial conditions. Why, it might be asked, should scientific laws be universal? And Popper's answer is there's a methodological argument for working with ideas which are as bold in the sense of being as testable as possible. Next, it might be argued, but just what's going on when we refute a theory? That's to say, in the light of just what does it make sense to conclude that a theory is or may be false? What's the character of the statements in the light of which we conclude this? And what's their relation to experience? Can we tell that they're true? And if not, does it make any sense to talk about refutation? I'll discuss this in later lectures about the empirical basis and conventionalism, which will be coming along soon. Finally, but perhaps crucially, one might ask, does Popper's theory work? Does it, as he thought, solve the problem of induction? Popper himself suggested, and his discussion in Objective Knowledge, Chapter 1 is useful on this, that one might look at this issue at three different levels. First, at the level of epistemology, second, at the level of human or indeed animal psychology, and third, in terms of human practical action. My own view is that his theory works well at the first two of these levels, although it needs to be supplemented there. But I think that there are problems at the third level, although I should emphasize many critical rationalists, and I would mention particularly my friends Ali Peyer and David Miller, don't agree with me about the latter stuff. However, I would at once say that I don't know of anything that, in respect of what I think are problems concerning the third problem, does any better. Epistemology. Here, I think that Popper's approach is fine. He pushes us towards boldness in our theories and stresses the significance of testability, while at the same time, our theory needs to be able to explain what has happened in the past. And if it is incompatible with other theories, it needs to be able to explain what they previously explained and also to meet other requirements. I'll say something about what these other requirements were that Popper introduced after the logic of scientific discovery in the next lecture. This seems to me to give a reasonable enough account of the growth of our theoretical knowledge, especially if it's supplemented by Popper's later ideas about metaphysical research programs and so on, which I'll talk about next time. It has the striking consequence that we must take even our common sense knowledge as open-endedly fallible, a view which the Wittgensteinian Norman Malcolm and the ordinary language philosopher J.L. Austin disagreed with. They didn't discuss Popper directly, but they spent some while discussing cases of common sense knowledge in the light of this problem, and in effect argued that truths known to common sense were simply to be preserved as true by means of conventionalist stratagems. And here on the left is Norman Malcolm, and on the right, J.L. Austin. But you must bear in mind, in terms of Popper's ideas, fallibility doesn't mean falsity. However, there have been some cases in which well-confirmed common sense knowledge has turned out to be false, and Popper has an interesting discussion of some examples of these in his Objective Knowledge, chapter 2. For example, bread baked in the regular way doesn't always nourish. There may be a fungal infection in the flour. Early explorers from the Mediterranean discovered that the sun doesn't in fact rise every day, and so on. And our own current scientific theories tell us that one day the world, all we love about it and all our comfortable regularities will no longer exist here. The whole lot will go. Next, psychology. Here I think that Popper is simply right and the empiricist tradition wrong. That's to say, it seems to me that you can make a very good case that we bring anticipations to the world, in part biological, in part cultural. And that if we are making what we take to be inductive generalizations, we are picking out some as opposed to other elements of experience as being the relevant ones to generalize about. And in addition, it's important to bear in mind that if we're talking about objects in the world, we're typically attributing to them dispositional properties to behave in certain kinds of ways, which go beyond what can in any sense be said to be directly given to us in experience. This happens even if we're not conscious that this is what we're doing. For example, if pure elements of experience did exist, how these should be extrapolated into a generalization is underdetermined by that pure experience. However, Popper could here, I think, make a certain concession if he wished to. Namely, someone may say, I am following an inductive procedure. Well, they could certainly follow something they call an inductive procedure, but the problems would be, first of all, that Hume, I think, was right that one can't provide a justification for it, and second, that it's not clear what procedure would be best. Someone may come up with one, someone else may come up with another. And if you're keen on the idea that at a practical level induction should work, put forward your own suggested theory of induction, ask friends to do so, see what you come up with, and see if there are differences between them. What would the content of it be? And if we have more than one, what might the grounds be for preferring one to the other? How should we assess it in relation to other such theories? The third area, practice. Popper's approach here seems to me to be that there's no better move than to make use of our best and best tested theories. Two difficulties have been raised here that seem to me to be rather interesting. First of all, there was one raised by John Watkins, namely that for Popper, science is bold. And one might then say, but look, if we're going to be guided by science, and Popper's approach to science encourages us to pick out what is bold, is there not a risk if we're basing action on something or in some way informing our actions by something which is in part constituted by taking risks? That's to say, if we want the growth of knowledge, boldness is obviously desirable as we can learn best from it. But if we are wishing to guide our practical actions, is boldness, and thus going way beyond what we've experienced and challenging common sense and other theoretical knowledge, really what we want? And I just leave you with this. Watkins later on, I think, had some reservations about his argument, this argument that he offered, but I think it's worth thinking about and seeing whether or not you reckon that there is a difficulty here. And here is a picture of John Watkins, the author of that. He taught for a long time in Popper's department in the LSE. The second issue is whether Nelson Goodman's so-called new riddle of induction doesn't hit Popper. I will here raise a problem on which other critical rationalists don't agree with me, and a lot of them just don't think that the problem is even significant. I think that it is significant and troubling. But I think it's a problem to which I'm not sure that there's any satisfactory response. I will here interpret Goodman's approach not in the form in which he presents it, but rather in terms of our attributing dispositional properties to things, which, as Popper has argued, are involved whenever we make use of a universal property in describing things. And the problem is, may we not, or wouldn't it be possible for people to attribute different dispositional properties to things from the ones that we normally do? Here's a picture of Nelson Goodman, and the ideas to which I'm referring are to be found in his Fact, Fiction, and Forecast. These dispositional properties that he raised may be considered either as suggesting that things have a certain dispositional property up to a particular point in time and a different one after that, so that, for example, rather than something being described as green, so that it has the dispositional property of looking green in suitable light, reacting in certain ways to ways of detecting colored light, not being the kind of color that you want to pick a shirt if you're going to wear an orange tie, and so on and so on. Particular dispositional properties are attributed to things by Green. Nelson's suggestion was, well, what about someone attributing a dispositional property to something that it grew? Namely, green, from our perspective, green up to a certain time and blue after that. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with as the problem. Nelson Goodman didn't put it in quite those terms, but I'm taking it in terms of our simply attributing one or other sort of dispositional property to the world. For those who see the world in Goodmanesque terms, there is just one dispositional property in terms of which they see things from the start. It's just that when described from our perspective, it would be seeing things as green up to a certain point and blue after it, and so on. And that it's we who are suggesting that there's a change of properties at a certain point in time, whereas for them, there is just a single property, but it is such that we would describe it in different ways before or after a particular point in time. Consider two people, Brian, who has our regular common sense dispositions in terms of which he interprets the world, which he attributes to things, and Brian, who lives on some other world and interprets the world in terms of Goodmanesque predicates. For Brian, our way of interpreting things seems natural, and his non-Goodmanesque theories about things are corroborated when they're tested. Brian sees things in Goodmanesque terms, but what is striking is that if he runs tests on them, his theories are also corroborated, because until we've hit the point where, from our perspective, there is a change in properties, it's just the same. However, relating to how we should do things at some time in the future, Brian and Brian's theories give us radically different predictions, yet up to that time, there seems to be no way in which we can rationally discriminate between them. From Brian's perspective, the other theories would look convoluted in the way in which Goodmanesque theories do to us. Further, when the time comes that the theories diverge, suppose that it's Brian who is vindicated. Does this help us with our philosophical problem? The answer, I think, is no, because there could, as it were, be as many Brians living in different worlds as we can imagine, each of whose theories indicate that the key time difference is for each particular instant now. That's to say, just because one of these theories gets knocked out doesn't mean that there aren't other ones which are perfectly okay. But whose theories would have said, along with Brian's, that the first Brian's theory was wrong? If you have a way around this, I would love to hear it in the discussion period. It might be objected, but this surely is the kind of thing that Popper doesn't take seriously. I'd invite those who take such a view to see what Popper said about what he called Agassiz predicates in his critical engagement with Carnap's demarcation between science and metaphysics, which is reprinted in Conjectures, and then also look at his references to Nelson Goodman in the proscript. It would look to me as if what Popper does is to admit these issues and to use them as an anti-inductivist argument, but that he doesn't then really explore whether there might be problems of the kind that I've indicated here in terms of looking at his own views of solving the practical problem of induction. It seems to me that we distinguish three different issues here. The first is, can we provide an objective justification for preferring non-Goodmanesque to Goodmanesque theories? I don't think that we can, and indeed some of what Popper has written in the places that I've referred to might suggest that it would be wrong to expect that we could do this. Second, does it matter? I think that it does, in the sense that on the face of it, the kind of theories which we favor here depends on a contingency, which doesn't relate to what the world is in fact like. For example, our ideas about these things are a matter of conjecture. or if the dispositions that we have are a matter of one rather than another pattern of understanding things, which happen to have been thrown up as an evolutionary mutation, then we could, as it were, be perfectly well either Brian or Blind. For whichever one had turned up wouldn't yet have been eliminated because we don't hit the point where these things diverge. Third, a wild idea, which I'm not suggesting should be taken too seriously, is this. It is part of the so-called Abrahamic tradition, that which underlies Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that I quote, man is made in God's image. Jews and Christians can here draw on Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, while for Muslims there is ahadith material on this theme. There's an interesting survey of this particular theme in the Islamic tradition in Christopher Melchert's God Created Adam in His Image in the Journal of Quranic Studies. If one already was a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, it might seem possible to argue that one had a non-arbitrary reason for suggesting that our, and thus Brian's, dispositions track what the world is like in terms of what one took to be revealed truth. Although the relationship between the relevant texts and what would be needed to resolve Goodman's problems looks, I think, a bit tenuous, but there may be a possibility here. And it's also possible that Goodman-style problems could be posed in ways which this does not resolve. For example, it's not clear that it actually needs things like these GRU or GRU, namely the Goodman predicates. However, from an atheistic perspective, it would seem completely arbitrary whether Brian or Blind has got things right. Although, of course, if a believer wished to embrace such an approach, this would lead to the questions of whether such a perspective was itself a reasonable one to take up. And here the atheist would presumably advance a range of objections to a theist view, and also ask just what and what should not be read into the idea of man being made in God's image. A final note here is this. As I've mentioned before, if someone favors a particular approach to induction, in the sense here of its offering a basis for suggesting one course of action rather than another, one might separate the proffered rule from the issue of whether it can be justified. And as far as I can see, as I've already indicated, there isn't a problem for the Popperian in seeing what someone might suggest as such a rule and critically evaluating it as compared to its competitors, provided that it wasn't being claimed that the choice of one such rule rather than another could be justified. But this leads us into issues which I will not explore further here. In the next lecture, I will be talking about some of the developments in Popper's philosophy subsequent to the logic of scientific discovery, after which I'll move into more detailed discussions of a variety of specific issues. At this point, I will stop the sharing of my screen and turn over to discussions. And I would mention again that if there are people who wouldn't want the discussion to be preserved on YouTube, please write to me after the lecture, because I could then ask the chap who is thinking of putting this material onto YouTube to make sure that he doesn't include that bit of the discussion. So if anyone has got comments, objections, Hussein, a question, a comment, an objection. Hussein? You have to unmute and put your question, or I'll move on to someone else. Okay,
He's
Hassan.
typing. He's typing.
He's typing. Ah,
yeah,
okay.
Typing. Yes.
Okay. Well, look, could I, until that's come up, move over to Hassan and then we'll come back to Hussein?
Yes. Thanks, Jeremy. I have two questions, not so much objections, but maybe it can be a sort of objection regarding your sharp distinction between the way that we have our inferences and our reasoning in philosophy, in science, etc., as opposed to the sort of formal logic that we use in the philosophy of logic, philosophy of mathematics, and so on. But as far as I understand, as far as I have my reading of Popper, Popper tries to show that we have, in fact, one type of reasoning everywhere, that we have that our reasoning is not inductive, so there is no problem of induction that way. And in fact, always we are using a sort of deductive inference, that we have some conjectures and then we have refutations. So I think for Popper, there is no such distinction at one type of reasoning, which is formal reasoning, just specific to mathematics, and other types of reasoning in science, in ordinary issues, in, for example, in metaphysics. So do you see a sort of tension here?
Well, what I was...
a continuum?
Can I speak to that? What I was trying to suggest was this. There is a tendency, of which Popper was himself critical, within people working in the philosophy of science, to really say, if we want to do work in philosophy, we should formalize. And I mean, I have quite often sat in seminars where people start discussing and someone runs up to a chalkboard and starts writing symbolic representations of what is being said. And I guess my argument is there may be good reasons to do this, but it seems to me you need a special reason to do it. And that, I think, is in line with what Popper has said, but that it is the case, for example, in his own theory of explanation, as I was trying to argue, that he tended at times to prefer formalistic theories and testability rather than allowing that it's perfectly respectable that we should be engaged in more informal metaphysical argument. And I guess personally, my feeling is that a lot of claims seem to be being made about our ability to solve philosophical problems if only we were sufficiently clear and formalized things. Now, I think this is perfectly true in some areas, so that if you look at the discussions about the relationship between mathematics and logic and so on, I mean, clearly, once you get beyond an initial sparring about these things, you pretty quickly have to get into formal questions of what, given certain assumptions, can and cannot be demonstrated. What I was raising as a problem was the widespread wish to take such approaches across philosophy generally. And I mean, my view really tends to be, if people are going to work on technical problems, all well and good, but it's just not clear that the rest of us are going to gain anything. And I suspect we'll actually lose quite a lot if we're expected to spend a lot of time learning techniques of formal representation and reasoning. And I further tried to argue that there is a lot of stuff about, I mean, for example, if a predicate is being introduced in logic, should it be understood intentionally or extensionally? I mean, it goes back, well, this can be, this I think is something that has to be explained, but typically people are just told what to do without any philosophical discussion. And it's this which I don't like very much. I would then also say, and this is heresy, and then I'll get back to the nub of what you were asking, which I think is a bit different. You see, Popper also took over particular ideas about content in terms of formal ways of understanding how the content of theories should be compared. Now, it turned out that when trying to make use of these things in relation to verisimilitude, his theories didn't work. In terms just of ordinary ideas about content comparison, it's not clear that they actually work. And I guess my personal view would be to say, look, there are serious issues here, but we might take a step or two back and say, well, just what is it that we're actually wanting to talk about when we're trying to compare theories or to throw light on what would have to be the case for one theory which we presume to be false to be in some sense closer to the truth than another theory. And this is where I think, I mean, if David Miller were anywhere around, he'd probably be tearing his hair out and would end up looking pretty much like me. I am not sure that the particular path towards formalization that was taken there was necessarily the right way to go. But we can see. I mean, I'm just saying these things should be put on the table and discussed rather than presumed. I take a step back though and say I'm not disagreeing with the idea that broadly the same style of reasoning and argument can be used across the board. I don't know enough about the philosophy of mathematics to know really whether or not that can be sustained. I mean, one way of reading Imre Lakatosh's Proofs and Refutations was an attempt to try and extend something closer to a Popperian approach into the philosophy of mathematics. I mean, I've read the material with interest, but it rather like work on the philosophy of quantum mechanics, quite quickly gets into areas where I just don't know enough about the substantive material that they're dealing with to be able to say anything. My impression is that Popper was, I mean, interested in, but a little bit skeptical about Lakatosh's approach. But I mean, I don't know. It just looks to me to be a very interesting question. But I wasn't trying to call that into question at all. Okay. Does that cover both your points?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I've got now, Hussein, you're asking, what are some meaningful metaphysical claims according to Popper? I would take it that the idea that every event has a cause is a meaningful metaphysical claim. It may or may not be true. There is a sense in which, I mean, it's also the case that we typically, I think, take the view that there is some sense in which we are morally responsible for our actions. Well, that also is not an empirical claim. It looks to me to be a metaphysical claim, but it's one where we can understand what someone means. We may say, if someone advocates that, well, look, I need to know a little bit more about what it is you're claiming before I can engage with you. But I think Popper's view is these are examples of metaphysical theories. Claims, for example, that in some fundamental sense, the world consists of atoms and the void, or claims, for example, that the universe is not self-subsistent, but has to be understood as the creation of God. I mean, all of these things are metaphysical theories. They may or may not be things which we can set about sensible discussion of, although I think in the case of all of those, one can talk about a whole lot of discussion in the history of philosophy and in the history of theology, where people have advanced these things, other people have understood what they were saying, there have been a lot of argument to and fro about them, and in certain cases it may turn out that developments in our knowledge in other areas, in some cases even empirical knowledge, in others, in other areas of philosophy or possibly even theology, may be things that in our judgment affect the tenability of one or other such claim. That's the kind of thing I was meaning. Does that make sense? Do you have a follow-up question, or is that okay? Follow-up? You can either type or speak, but to speak you need to unmute. I'm going to come to Carlos next. Hussein, do you want to make a follow-up or not? No? No. Okay. You can always come back later. Next, I've got Carlos.
Yes, Jeremy, I just want to make a remark about your saying or stating what is Popper's relation to empiricism, okay? And I don't know if I understand you quite right, but I think we have to emphasize that Popper was an empiricist, and he acknowledged that his conception was empirical because, as he says many times, as he said many times, he accepts the fundamental thesis of empiricism, in the meaning that only experience can decide about the truth or falsity of the statement referring to reality. So I think that probably I want to emphasize that Popper was an empiricist.
Okay, I'd make two comments about that. I think that you can say, first of all, that some of the things which Popper said later should be taken to qualify that statement that you just quoted. For example, consider the ideas of Descartes about the structure of the world and his ideas about the basis on which physics should be developed. Popper, in a later paper, discusses the way in which Leibniz offered a compelling criticism of Cartesian programmatic ideas about how we should understand the world, and argued in effect that a purely mechanical theory of the sort that Descartes favored wouldn't actually in principle work, because there are certain kinds of things, for example, the phenomenon of two solids hitting and bouncing off one another, that one couldn't actually explain in Cartesian terms. So, first of all, I would say, while you're quite correct in what you say concerning Popper and the logic of scientific discovery, it seems to me that we may be able to engage in factual learning by way of people being able to argue that a particular theory, which had been understood to be adequate to the explaining of various kinds of phenomena, in fact isn't. The second thing that I'd say is this. If you take the material that you quoted from Popper, there is the question, how in that is experience to be understood? And in this respect, it seems to me that there are some important divisions within the empiricist tradition. People from John Locke through David Hume up to many 19th and 20th century writers took experience to mean people's subjective experience. They further typically took the view that this was to be understood in terms of something like sensations, ideas, or sense data. Now, Popper's view is on the one side that you don't have pure experience in the way in which these people were appealing to the idea in, I think, what is the mainstream of the empiricist tradition. And secondly, and I'll discuss this in a lecture on the topic, his ideas about the empirical basis, I take to be that really what we should be interested in are claims that people make in appropriate circumstances about, if they undertake an observation, about what is to be seen, what there is out there in the world, rather than about their experiences of things. And so in these respects, in interpreting the material that you're quoting, I think there are significant differences between Popper and what is normally understood to be the empiricist tradition. Do come back at me, Carlos.
Yes, no, I agree with your interpretation about Popper and empiricism in general, okay? I just want to remark the issue that Popper also in objective knowledge, he again emphasized that he's accepted the principle of empiricism, okay? That only experience can help us to make our mind about true or falsity. Of course, he put experience between a quoting mark, okay?
Okay.
Because that is what I just want to emphasize that Popper accepts this sort of principle of empiricism,
well,
but we need to clarify Popper empiricism in general.
You're correct. You're quoting things correctly, but my first comment about the argument from Leibniz about Descartes, I think has to be taken as serving in some ways to qualify that.
Okay.
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 No, that's fine. Now, we've got now, I have next Margareta and then Darush. Margareta.
Hi, Jeremy. So since you have mentioned objective knowledge, so as a book,
yes,
I'm surprised and intrigued that you haven't mentioned yet World 3, because Popper is already talking about objective knowledge in the logic of scientific discovery. Because there are passages there where he say we need to make a distinction between objective and subjective knowledge. And the way that I understood it always, I mean, from the first moment I read it, he's talking literally about books. And you have written also about it, but I think that is such a crucial element to Popper in his whole research paradigm, that it's not just enough that we think something, we need to write it down. And it's only when it's written down that things become interesting. And his whole methodology is about the fact that we need to read it down, and then we read it and we talk about it and we listen and we argue. So I'm just curious why it hasn't shown up yet.
Okay.
World 3.
Well, what I would say is this. I am not disagreeing with your emphasis on this in Popper. What I would say is really this. First, there is a sense in which making a separation between logic and psychology was characteristic of Popper's approach, but it was also something which was widely found in earlier writers such as Frege and actually in the early writings of Husserl as well. The ideas about World 3 and the questions about whether World 3 is to be understood as having an actual existence, separate from instantiations and representations of theories and so on, is stuff which I will come on to later in the course. But I mean, those things I think are separate from the point that you are very reasonably stressing, and where it seems to me that it's not that clear how much actually it hinges in terms of what Popper is saying about the actual or potential existence of World 3 objects. But that, as I say, is an interesting question. But you mustn't forget that this is the third of 23 lectures. So there is going to be a fair bit of stuff about the mind-body problem and about issues about reduction, and we'll come on to that in due course. But you're right to stress its importance. You're muted.
Okay, my follow-up was going to be, since the Vienna Circle was brought up, that also there is Wittgenstein's Bildung, or the picture theory, and that Popper said there's something wrong with it. So that the whole thing is about how do we relate to World 3, and is that the problem is not just the World 3, but also our relation to it, and that the problem is all those people who think of it as representational of the reality, like a photograph is. I'm looking now at some artifact on my screen, and I'm trusting that it's you, so I don't really need to worry about the artifact. That the theory is different. A written piece of paper is totally different from the reality about which it's talking, and that is kind of a key element to Popper's philosophy.
Well, yes, look, I'm not disagreeing with you. I guess what I would say is, well, I should say just in passing that in fact I am much slimmer, more handsome, and have much more hair than the representation of here actually indicates. But to get back to something serious, look, the issues that you've been stressing are important, but there are complications about the status of Popper's World 3. I mean, not about what it does, but about just what he's claiming, and issues about whether or not in principle it might reduce to other things, which I mean, if I'm going to talk about it, that needs a lecture in itself. So I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the issue about the importance of it. I'm having to go one step at a time in this. Okay.
Yeah.
No. Darush.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you very much. This is a very quick question. There's a part that I kind of missed. You were saying about Ali Paya and David Miller disagreeing with you. Could you please rephrase and briefly clarify that? Thank you.
Yes, what I was trying to say is, I mean, David Miller has written quite a bit about issues to do with Popper and practical action. And I think that both he and Ali Paya think that the approach that he has offered to this is adequate. I think that it doesn't really deal with the kind of issue that I was mentioning. We've had various exchanges on this, but haven't really got very far. They tend to stress very much the importance of the idea that we don't actually act on theories. But I think we possibly would need, well, no, I can do better than this. What I will do is, in the notes that I distribute based on this lecture, I will dig out some references to David's writing on this and suggest that you have a look at them. But I mean, we've had exchanges where I indicate my skepticism. He has indicated that he doesn't think I should be skeptical about it. We haven't got a lot further than that, but I've had to go to yourselves just in informally explaining why I reckon that there is an outstanding difficulty here.
Lovely. I would really appreciate it if you could send that to us as well in the notes. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
Anything else at all, or have we come to the end of the discussion? Ah, Hassan, you need to unmute.
Sure. I have another rather objection regarding your claim that Popper's philosophy of science, especially in conjectures in the logic of scientific discovery, is mainly normative and it's not that much descriptive. So he was not interested in the history of science. I don't know if you just...
No. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you look at the discussion of what he calls naturalism in the logic of scientific discovery, a naturalistic theory would be essentially a theory of how descriptively scientists are behaving. And I think Popper's view is, I think it's best expressed in terms of saying that, first of all, he's emphasizing that there may be different views about what people should be aiming at in science. And secondly, that there are obviously different schools and approaches within science, and that his approach is one where, on the one side, I think he would argue for the preferability of taking certain views as being what science should be aiming at, and then as saying, well, if you find that convincing, then there are certain things that you should then try and do. Now, I think he thinks that this is exemplified in the work of some scientists, but it's also clearly the case that even very distinguished scientists may at times have been aiming for different things, or may have held different philosophical views. I mean, Newton notoriously described his own method as a form of induction. Now, Popper thinks that this actually misdescribes what was involved. He was involved at different times with, in lots of arguments with scientists about current science, about what they might usefully be aiming for in current science, and so on. And I think it's also the case that from Popper's perspective, at times, what has happened in science could possibly go badly wrong. Lakatos, by contrast, kind of tends to present his views in methodology as being what the best scientists were really doing, even when they said they were doing other things. So, I mean, this isn't to say that Popper is coming in saying, you scientists don't know what you're doing. He's saying, look, everyone has got various philosophical theories, including about ideas about method, including ideas about the aims of science. All of these things are fallible. And if I can put words into Popper's mouth, I take it that his argument is one to the effect that, first of all, we should aspire towards realist scientific theories, although they'd be fallible at the same time. And this then means that if there are people who are working with theories which can't be interpreted realistically, from Popper's perspective, it will be good to look to see if we can develop alternative theories to these ones which would be susceptible to a realist explanation. If they have ideas about methodology, these may be problematic. It should also be said that Popper, even where he personally thought that some scientists may have got things wrong, tended to think that it was really very good if scientists concerned themselves with these sorts of issues and would stand back from criticizing people in public if it looked as if this might be problematic. And so there was a guy, a French biologist called Jacques Monod, who wrote a book called Chance and Necessity. And Popper, I think, had some reservations about this. I mean, he admired Monod's work. He had reservations about the book. But I think that while if Monod had asked him, he would have been willing to talk to him about it, he really didn't want to go on public record slanging off the book just because this would be problematic. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Someone has just reproduced a lot of material in the chat, which I've only just seen. Luke, do you want to, could you read this to us and then pose a question?
Yes, because I think that's a very nice quote about Popper, because we were talking about that Popper was an empiricist, and that's in the Schott volume, and I think it's a very nice quote. Wait, but I have to see how I can read it. Here it is. It's a very nice quote. I think he writes also, I was and still am an empiricist of some sort, though certainly not a naive empiricist who believes that all knowledge stems from our perception or sense data. My empiricism is consistent in the view that, though all experience was theory impregnated, it was experience which in the end could decide the fate of a theory by knocking it out, and also in the view that only such theories which in principle were capable of being thus refuted merited to be counted among the theories of empirical science. Yeah. I think that's a very nice quote, yes.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that, except insofar as I stressed in responding to Carlos, that he also does admit that there may be non-empirical arguments which can show the inadequacy of various theories about the explanatory theories about the world. Mm-hmm. So but what you're saying in what you quoted, he distances between himself and what is quite often to be taken the empiricist tradition. So we're not in disagreement about that, but I want to stress that there is this other element to it which needs to be added to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Now, anyone else, or should we pack it in for the evening? Hussein, your hand is still up. Bart, a hand is up.
Yes, I had one small question. You mentioned David Miller's concept of people not acting according to theories. It was a brief comment you made. Could you qualify it a little bit so we are a little bit better capable of digging into the literature you're going to send
Well-
after the lecture, but it was begging for some qualification. I
Well-
cannot really understand what it's meant.
Well, I think the best that I can do is to send you references to the material in which David explains this. I mean, he makes, as it were, a great deal of fuss about saying that people don't act on the basis of scientific theories. He then offers his own formulations. I have really, well, I'm in general full of admiration for David's work, have found this stuff a little difficult to get my head around. I mean, I can't quite see what he's actually saying. And I also can't see whether he can offer or what sort of response he offers to the kind of issues that I was raising in terms of the reinterpretation of Goodman. So what it's best that I do is to look at that stuff, to append it to as a footnote to this material, and then if you find it baffling, I can have an attempt. I can make an attempt to explain it, and if not, possibly what we might be able to do is to invite David to see if he would come along one day and try and cast some light on this. But I mean, there are some theories where I think I can make a reasonable stab at giving a good account of them. David's response to this is one that I just find it rather difficult to see quite what he's up to or how it resolves the problems. And I'm not sure that I can do a lot better than that. I'm sorry to be a bit of a disappointment. Well, I mean, I may already have been a massive disappointment in terms of other things, but in this, I am explicitly setting out to disappoint you for the reasons indicated. Any other questions, or do you want to call it a night? Margareta, were you trying to get in again as well? Or
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Since you went in great detail into the Goodman, the Nelson Goodman example, first of all, I should say I quickly looked at the lectures that are coming, and I didn't see the topic explicitly linked to any of the lectures. So that's the reason I'm bringing it up now.
Sorry, what topic?
Relation to time, how we think about time.
How we think about what?
Time, the clock.
Time.
Clock
I know.
running.
It's not something that, well.
Well, I think it is. I think it relates to that problem, or at least what I just want to say. The problem made me think about time. Just is the future already existing, or do we create it? And so the green, blue, or grew, like it's green and then it becomes blue. You could kind of say that is the creation of plutonium. So plutonium, I think it's plutonium, some artificially created element. So we don't have the problem, and then suddenly we do have the problem. And the problem is there because of human action. So the future is created, the future is imagined. So that it kind of throws this problem of how do we think about time to us. So anyway,
okay,
I'm just throwing a problem.
Okay. Look, I'd say two things. The first thing that I want to stress is this: the issue about Goodman, he raised in terms of time, but I've seen other formulations of it which are posed without bringing in time. A second thing is this: as I tried to explain the problem, it was a matter of just what dispositions we attribute to things. And where the point that I was trying to make about that has come up in the discussion of Goodman, and it's the following, that from a Popperian point of view, we are simply predisposed to see things in certain terms, and we attribute certain kinds of properties to what we're seeing. We have a predisposition to look for certain relationships in things, or to claim that there are certain relationships in things. That predisposition is not itself something that is based on experience. It's simply something which, if you like, comes up as a by chance mutations, and then is weeded out if it's problematic. And I was just making the simple point that unless you want to go with the notion that mankind is made in the image of God in the relevant way, so that what in this respect comes naturally to us is actually checking what things are like, it is perfectly possible that there could be creatures who have formed other kinds of expectations, who have attributed other dispositional properties to things, who've actually symmetrically with us conducted exactly the same sort of tests as we have done, and where so far their theories about them haven't been refuted. Okay? So it isn't, I mean, the particular predicates as I introduce them relate to time, but it's more a matter of saying things could have been different. We haven't got these predicates by instruction from the world. It's a matter of conjecture and refutation. What if people had been predisposed to see the world in a different way? They would have had a science that is symmetrical with ours, but which would, in respect of the future, say different things. Okay. Luke, are you coming in with a question?
Well, I just received a message from Laila Badran that she was not invited this time. I don't know, she didn't receive your email. You'll be invited for the course.
Well, could, if you know of someone who doesn't, who is wanting to take the course and doesn't get the invitation, can you send them?
Yeah, but she has taken the course before, eh? She was here.
Well, I simply don't understand what has happened, because I sent out the recordings of lectures 1 and 2, the the scripts of 1 and 2, and the invitation to this lecture all at once. So I don't understand why some people haven't got them.
Yeah, but you know, sometimes that happens to enter in a spam folder, or they don't receive it. That happens.
Well, all I'd say is, if you come across someone in that situation, that two things. First of all, you now know that these things occur on a regular scheduled basis. And if someone hasn't, by the time we get to the day before the lecture, hasn't received stuff, they need to email me again.
Yes, of course.
And then otherwise, I am recording everything, and I am sending out the recording of each lecture to anyone who wants it.
Yes, of course.
But I do convey my apologies.
Yes, I will, and I'll tell her that maybe you should mention it next time. That yeah, but okay, I'll tell her that if she doesn't receive one, then she should ask you next time.
Yes, that'd be good. Now, does anyone want to ask a further question? Margareta, are you there with another question, or is this your old question?
That was my old question.
Okay. Well, could I ask again, does anyone want to ask a further question or make an objection? Or if not, can I call it a day thank you very much for participating.
Bye-bye.
I will send you tidied up versions of the material together with the invitation to the 4th lecture, which is on some developments after the logic of scientific discovery. Thank you all very much. And if
Thank you
you've
very
got
much,
other
Jeremy.
objections, just write to me and I will try to resolve any problem that I can. Okay, thanks very much.
Many
Thank
thanks.
you, Jeremy.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Fine. Bye-bye.